It's more a referendum than an election. Egypt, the Arab world's most populous state, kicking off 3 days of voting to re-elect Abdel Fattah el-Sisi to another 4-year term. The former field marshal cleared the decks by gently, or not so gently, dissuading any serious challengers. His only rival plucked from obscurity for the purposes of an exercise that's really about the turnout. We're going to take stock of where Egypt's heading 7 years after the Arab Spring forced out Sisi's former boss, Hosni Mubarak, and nearly 5 years after the incumbent toppled the Muslim Brotherhood-led government in a coup. How many of those who cheered then still support Sisi? Why the enduring wholesale crackdown on dissent? Despite abuses, Sisi enjoys the continued backing of Washington and buys warplanes from France. Yes, it's with an eye to radical insurgency in North Sinai. But what is the best way to support a nation where the population is soaring and growth is struggling to keep pace? Today in the France 24 debate, what next for Egypt? Joining us from Washington, former U.S. diplomat Michele Dunne, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
From Cairo, Mohamed Kamal, founder of international business consultants. Let's see if I pronounce this right. Do it for me, please. What is the name of the consultancy?
Hi, how you doing?
It's Igenez. How would you pronounce it?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you clear. Can you say it again?
Your consultancy, how would you pronounce it?
It's the 3 letters of Egypt, which is EGY, and NZ as in part for New Zealand, so it's Egens.
Egens,
there we go. You can pronounce it whichever way you like.
All right, thanks for joining us. From London,
Thank you.
Mahazam, president of the Istanbul-based Egyptian Revolutionary Council, founded in reaction to that coup that toppled the Muslim Brotherhood-led government. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And from New York, Ahmed Ben Shemsi of Human Rights Watch. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter. The hashtag F24debate. Tight security. Egypt has deployed tens of thousands of policemen and soldiers, and plenty of time, 3 days, to get out the vote, with the odds stacked in favor of the incumbent. Kathy Clifford has more.
A man of 2 personas, for some an anchor of stability, for others an autocrat. Abdel Fattah el-Sisi rose to power through the ranks of Egypt's military, appointed commander-in-chief of the army in August 2012 by then-President Mohamed Morsi, who he would help to topple 9 months later.
This roadmap includes the temporary suspension of the constitution, the holding of early presidential elections, with the president of the Constitutional Council who will supervise the interim, pending the election of a new president.
A month after the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces took power with Sisi as defense minister, a bloody crackdown against Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood movement began, when at least 800 protesters were killed in central Cairo, according to Human Rights Watch. Then in March 2014, Sisi resigned to run for president. With his charismatic presence and emotional speeches, many Egyptians saw him as the strong leader needed to bring back stability to the country.
I stand before you for the last time in a military uniform, after deciding to end my service as defense minister and commander of the armed forces. With all modesty, I nominate myself for the presidency of Egypt.
Sisi went on to win 96% of the vote. His priority to fight Islamist terrorism and stabilize the Middle East have made Sisi a key intermediary for the West, particularly in the Libyan crisis. At home, though, global critics accuse him of a return to the authoritarian rule the Tahrir Square revolution fought to escape. In this latest presidential election, all but one opponent have dropped out of the race, though the president's campaign team say none have been prevented from running.
And that one opponent, his name is Musa Mustapha. Musa, he's quoted as saying, after voting, it's not the winner that matters. Either way, it's Egypt that'll be the winner. Mohamed Kamal, I got to say, it's kind of strange, an election where the challenger says it doesn't matter who wins.
It is kind of changed, but you're in Egypt after all. It's just everything is a little bit different, yes. The reality is everyone that is patriotic enough to look at Egypt going forward, understand the value of the current leadership. What happened over the last 4 years is by anyone's standard exceptionally remarkable. Going by the type of leadership that is in place, the objection is that a military general is running the country. That is completely misconstruing, because the reality is he stepped out of the military and he became a civilian president, believe it or not. Right now, the vision of going forward to Egypt, I think, would be better interpreted in numbers as opposed to looking at it in an emotional or even in a political view. I think the numbers in the last 4 years, looking at 20 major national projects, looking at the GDP per capita that has been incrementally increasing over the last 4 years, looking at the National Reserve of Exchange being one of the most remarkable over the last decade, it says that something is moving forward, and it's moving forward in a base that is quite remarkable for a country with 104 million people. When you put all these together, while there is a hideous amount of pressure on the Joe Blow in the street from the economic reform that the country is going through, but someone had to do it.
All right, let's pick up on those points, and we will talk about the question of the economy in a moment. But let me first pick up on one remark you make and put it to Ahmed Benchemsi, because I know you have to leave us, unfortunately, quickly. Ahmed, does it feel to you like a civilian regime or a military regime?
Well, it feels like a regime where most basic freedoms have been suppressed under the guise of a president who is a member of the army and an all-powerful army. So I guess you can call it whatever you want based on that simple fact. Now, this election that is happening, I mean, we and other human rights organizations and civil society organizations have called it unfair, unethical, and we even use the word farcical, which we don't often use. I mean, we don't often use that kind of words. I mean, human rights language is pretty stern in general, but this is an indication of how deeply biased it all is. I mean, the Egyptian government has trampled over even the minimum requirements for free and fair presidential elections. Basic freedoms have been stifled, potential candidates have been arrested, even supporters have been rounded up. And not even to mention staff members of candidates. So, I mean, what else is left? Your report mentioned that, I mean, you broadcasted the image of President Sisi, former candidate Sisi, posing in military garb and saying, "This is the last time you see me posing in this garb," where that is ironical, because one of the potential candidates who have been arrested, Colonel Ahmed Qunsuwa, was precisely arrested for the same reason, for announcing his intention to run for the presidency while wearing military garb. Well, President Sisi did exactly the same a couple of years ago, and nothing happened to him. So this is only an example among many others that shows how deeply flawed these elections are.
Ahmed Benchemsi, I want to thank you for joining us from New York. I know you have to leave us early, and it's unfortunate. I want to go around the table and ask some of the others about this vote, and I'll begin with you, Michele Dunne, because it's been portrayed by some as a choice between stability or democracy. Is that the way you see it from Washington?
Well, the sad fact about this election is that Egyptians don't face any choice at all. All the choices were eliminated. You know, Mr. Kamal used the word remarkable. I think what was remarkable was the fact that 5 serious people, 3 of them from the military, stood up and said they wanted to run against Sisi, and they were serious about it. They were criticizing Sisi, and they wanted to pose themselves as real alternatives. That was pretty surprising, considering how much repression has taken place in Egypt. So it shows you there really is opposition to Sisi. Some of it is from within his own regime, and certainly it is in the circles who supported him back in 2013, 2014 when he took power. So, you know, that is what is going on. It's not a choice between stability and democracy. Right now, Egyptians have no choice for democracy at all. Egypt had a very brief 2-year democratic experiment that was ended. It was chaotic, but it was ended abruptly by the military coup. In the report that you had, it said something about how, you know, that brought about an early election and so forth. But what it really did was not just end the regime of President Morsi from the Muslim Brotherhood. It ended the entire democratic experiment.
Ended the democratic experiment? Did it end it for good, Maha Azam?
What it's done is it's delayed the democratic process and at a very high cost. What we're seeing in Egypt today are not elections by any means. They don't have the features of any free and fair elections. There's no freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. There are over 60,000 political prisoners, as we've heard. Any challenger to Sisi was either arrested or had to withdraw his candidacy. What we have is a search for a mandate to carry on with the same form of political repression that we've seen over the last 4 years and what we've seen over decades in Egypt. There was only a short blip in that during 2011 to 2012 where we could have said that the beginnings of the democratic process could have gone underway and those were interrupted by a military coup.
But but at the time, that military coup had a lot of support in a lot of quarters. People thought that this transition was chaotic. They didn't like the Muslim Brotherhood. So there was popular support, genuine popular support, and there still is in a lot of quarters for Sisi.
I think that very clearly what happened after the military coup proved that we weren't on the roadmap to democracy anymore. I don't think that the idea that a democratic experiment was having a difficult year would justify a military coup against it. And what happened was that the process was not allowed to continue.
But are people haunted by that process is the question.
No, I think they are haunted now by 4 years of repression, not only of the Muslim Brotherhood, but of anyone who dares speak out. They're haunted by the fact that the military regime that exists in Egypt is among the most despotic and authoritarian regimes that Egypt has experienced since the Nasser period. And they're haunted by the fact that the economic situation is not improving and that the vast majority of Egyptians live under a military regime where corruption is rife and where repression is rife.
Earlier this month, President Sisi put his military fatigues back on, telling a conference in Cairo, "I'm ready to put on a military uniform and go out and fight side by side with you." This during commemorations for soldiers killed in North Sinai, the fight against radicals in the desert region bordering Israel. High in the minds when Western leaders speak with Sisi, like, for instance, last month when the outgoing U.S. Secretary of State visited Cairo.
We agreed that we would continue our close cooperation on counterterrorism measures, including our joint commitment to the defeat of ISIS. And Egypt has been a very important member of the Defeat ISIS coalition.
Michele Dunne, the attitude of Washington towards Cairo, would it have been any different under a Democratic administration?
Actually, I think that Washington has been wanting to cooperate with whoever was in power in Cairo. That included Mubarak, it included Morsi during his presidency, and it has included Sisi. But when we speak of the fight against terrorism, look, Egypt has a serious terrorist insurgency. I would not diminish that at all. It's a serious problem. But questions have grown more and more in Washington about whether President Sisi's policies are really fighting this or in some ways fueling it. We do see there's some military effort. There's been a recent military campaign against the terrorist insurgency, but the degree of repression, of human rights abuses, scorched earth policies used in Sinai, where the hottest part of the insurgency is taking place, these have alienated many parts of the Egyptian population, and any military commander will tell you, and I think American military commanders have learned this and have learned some hard lessons about this, that the number one tool that is needed in fighting terrorism and insurgency is the cooperation of the population. And it's been difficult for Sisi to get that in view of the rapidly expanding repression. It has gone far beyond the Muslim Brotherhood, other Islamists, secular opposition, and now it's even against people from within his own regime. People we see now, people from the military, perhaps the director of intelligence being put into prison.
Mohamed Kamal, is Mohamed Sisi, do you agree with what was just said there by Michele Dunne, that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is just not winning hearts and minds when it comes to this fight against Islamists?
I think I've got a few points that I need to... thanks, Michele, for her point of view, of course, but I need to answer a couple of things. I heard the word repression being mentioned a few times, and I'm wondering what's the definition of repression as far as Michele is concerned. The issue is when you have a radical group like the Brotherhood hijacking the country and trying to run the country into the ground, very much similar to that democracy that happened in Iraq in 2003. I don't see Iraq being a highly democratic country. We all know what's happening in Iraq. We all know what's happening in Syria and Yemen, for example, Libya, for example. The NATO and the US went in to clear Gaddafi. The dictatorship of Gaddafi was destroying Libya. Where is Libya today? It's just a playground for all radical groups.
Explain, for
now,
instance...
Egypt, just going back to my point, back to my point, the issue here. Now, Ahmed earlier on said it's an unfair election because everyone that put their name out to try and be a candidate for presidency was arrested. Now, we all know that there is a legal framework for you as a military person to go and practice in a civilian life and become a candidate for election. You need to take permission from the military council. Both candidates that put their name forward did not follow due diligence and did not have the authorization of their superiors to go and put their name forward. So they've been prosecuted and they've been arrested. I can't see where is the break of the law in this particular process. That's a little bit of a little bit of weird kind of definition when you're talking about democracy and not allowing the law to take precedence in that process. Now, the other thing is, can we just talk about democracy as a definition we all see in a similar light? Because democracy, as the Greek have invented it, is not being practiced anywhere in the world, up and including the United States, the land of democracy. We all know that that definition can kind of vary a little bit according to the agendas. So right now, I'm not going to go into details. All I can tell you is, in this country, living here, having lived in New Zealand, one of the most transparent countries in the world and one of the most diplomatically clear and neutral countries in the world, you can feel the difference straight away when you get to Egypt. The reality is there's no suppressions. I have the right to go and do whatever I want. Let me give you, and everyone have the right to go and say whatever they want.
Let me give you just one example. Shaukan, this Egyptian photojournalist who was reporting on the Muslim Brotherhood when they were entrenched in 2013 near Rab al-Adawa Square. He's been in pre-trial detention now for 4 years. Is that rule of law?
I'm not a prosecutor. I don't know about the law, and I don't know what is his crime that be arrested for. The truth of the matter is there is a legal framework in Egypt. No, that's not true. He knows because he's been prosecuted. He's been charged by a legal case to be standing in a court. He is in a pre-trial detention for a reason, sir. In order for you to go to the Attorney General and be prosecuted or being detained in a waiting for a trial, you have to be charged in the first place. No one goes out in the street, pick you up and take you in a box and say, you wait here until we decide what are we going to do with you. It doesn't work like that, not in Egypt, not anywhere in the world. So we just have to be a bit realistic. The fact that some of these charges are not publicly known, there is national security reasons for some of these crimes not to be publicly known. So the reality is we take an eclectic approach about the information coming from Egypt and decide to draw the picture to suit the direction we'd like to say. Now, the reality is I am an Egyptian. I'm living in Egypt on the ground. I didn't go anywhere, and I can see it happening in front of me. And I personally think I feel safe. I feel absolutely fine. None of my family, friends, and all my network has been arrested for having a radical opinion. Some of my relatives have radical opinions, and nobody ever told them what they're doing.
All right. This question of human rights was brought up last year when Sisi came to Paris. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, in his presence, was quizzed on about the crackdown on dissent.
I'm aware of the security context in Egypt and the conditions which President Sisi is working in. I also believe in the sovereignty of the states. And in the same way that I do not accept that other leaders lecture me on how to govern my country, I won't lecture leaders myself.
Maazam, your reaction when you heard Emmanuel Macron's words?
I mean, obviously, there are deals to be done between Egypt and France. As we all know, governments do business with governments. That doesn't mean that Egypt today doesn't have the worst human rights record for a very long time. What we heard earlier from one of the participants in this program is really an attempt to fool the public. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the United Nations Human Rights Council, all have clearly stated the human rights abuses, extrajudicial killings, torture and so on are systematic in Egypt. There is no way to defend this regime. This is a tyrannical regime that doesn't allow any freedom for anyone to voice their opinion. This is not an issue about the Muslim Brotherhood. It's an issue about ordinary Egyptian citizens whose rights and freedoms have been denied, and there has been a serious clampdown on any freedoms. President Sisi, or General Sisi, is very afraid. He has control, but he hasn't got enough control to open the country up to the right to protest, the right of freedom of speech. The system, the military intelligence now controls the media. The judiciary is an arm of the military. Egypt is seriously a republic of fear today. And those people doing business there can turn a blind eye and continue to try to invest. But the issue is that the conditions in Egypt today, whether it regards freedom or for the majority of Egyptians that are poor and disenfranchised, the situation is very critical, and it is therefore critical for Egypt's stability and Egypt's future.
Yeah, let's talk about the economic side of things. Egypt this past year had a 5% growth rate. However, if you subtract a birth rate that's going up again after several years of a decline, well, do the math and you'll see that you can take off 3.3%. That's, well, less than 2% if you factor that in. The nation now boasts more than 100 million people and counting, with a lot of those people, of course, concentrated in the Nile Valley and the Nile Delta. With this population growth that we're seeing, Michele Dunne, what can any president of Egypt do?
It is a really difficult economic situation, and undoubtedly it's been made worse by the political turmoil of certain years. I mean, you mentioned a 5% growth rate, but we have to remember that's against a very low base.
I mean, there are positive signs.
Really
Michele Dunne, there's tourism, which is again on the uptick after years of going down. And we have these big infrastructure projects which are stimulating the economy.
I have to say I don't agree about that part. On tourism, yes, Egypt has unparalleled resources for tourism, right? No other country in the world has the kind of historical heritage that Egypt has, as well as beautiful beaches and so forth. So tourism will always gradually return to Egypt as long as there are not too many terrorist attacks. And that is happening, although slowly. But on the infrastructure projects, I don't think they're generating large numbers of jobs. We have seen the Suez Canal expansion project, which is widely acknowledged now to have been a costly failure. That, yes, it took place and it was built, but it did not generate the kind of revenue for the state that was expected. Now the Sisi government is building, again, at great cost, a new administrative capital outside of Cairo. And with the exception of some temporary construction jobs, it's not at all clear how this is going to drive the economy forward. There are two ways in which Egypt really should be developing its economy. One of them is human development. You mentioned a rapidly expanding population. Egypt really needs much more of a labor-driven economic strategy to train its labor force, make them globally competitive, and figure out what kind of industries, services, etc., are best to employ them. That's not happening. The other thing is water. Egypt is facing a potentially very serious shortage of water within a few years, both because of growing population as well as the fact that Ethiopia is building a dam and less water is going to be arriving to Egypt. So those are two areas in which Egypt really should be investing in development of the labor force and in changing over the method of water use, particularly in agriculture, so that they will not run into a serious water crisis. But that's not what we see happening. Instead, this military-led government does what it knows how to do, which is to build big projects, to carry out big construction projects that really don't have a direct connection to the development of the country and of the economy.
Mohammed Kamal, when the people protested in 2011 in Tahrir Square, one of the things that we heard a lot was protest against the fact that too many soldiers, and high-ranking soldiers, had their fingers in the economy, a bit like with the Revolutionary Guards in Iran. Their tentacles were in the economy, the so-called deep state, and that as a result, there was corruption everywhere. That's not really changing, is it?
You can't change corruption that built up over decades and overnight. That's a fact known to anyone. But I need to step a couple of steps backward to what Michele have just said about the large major infrastructure project. One, she mentioned that they're not labor intense, which I don't know how. The reality is, in order for Egypt to move forward, you need industries that are producing and that they are also labor intense. You need to employ people. Now, one important thing is, she mentioned the reality is that the human resource, you need to invest in human development. Now, Egypt going through a major educational overhaul, both from technical and vocational education to make sure that it's internationally benchmarked, but also in tertiary level. In saying that, water was mentioned a little while. I'm not sure how accurate Michele's information and how up to date, but there is a major desalination station that is currently in Sinai. There is a lot of work that is being done with groundwater in areas like in the south of Egypt, in Farafra, for example, with this 1,000 hectare of land that are being developed at the moment for agriculture. The idea of Egypt moving forward, in order to have projects that are labor intense and industrial and manufacturing based, you need infrastructure, you need roads, you need electricity. For example, these major electricity project that has been done, one of the largest ever station that Siemens have done in their entire history is currently in Egypt. One of the largest wind farms and solar energy farms. Egypt is now preparing for transnational exportation of power, as opposed to a country that have a very huge shortage of power. Now, moving forward, you need the infrastructure in order to build upon. But without that infrastructure, you're going nowhere. That's number one. Number two, I prefer to get the information from the source. And when you have the government declaring in transparency in public TV that the military involvement with the economy is approximately 2% of the GDP. This is not billions and not large people from the military. What you need to realize that the corruption that you mentioned earlier have made some of the businessmen in Egypt, not mentioning director sectors, but have manipulated the market to a degree that the poor Joe Bloke in the street, after the economic reform, cannot afford to buy basic, essential commodities and products. And the military had to intervene to create a fair balance within this market. That's a reality. That's what is happening right now. But corruption is going to go away? Yes, eventually, but it will take time to get rid of what was embedded by a number of very lazy government in the past, by the infiltration of brotherhood in every single level of central and regional government. And that level of corruption happened and exacerbated after September 11, and it was deliberately exceeded.
All right, let me ask Mahazam a view on what Egypt will look like in 4 years' time, because we're almost out of time here.
I think that unless there is political change in Egypt, the economy will continue to falter. You have a growing number of youth, a growing number of unemployed. And to go back to the figures, under Mubarak there was 5% growth, and 2011 occurred. The same features that brought about 2011 are far stronger there today. There is greater anger, I believe, under the surface. There is greater anxiety about the economy, and there is a growing population. Egypt needs political opening up. It needs a return to democracy so that we can have accountability and so that we can end corruption and so there can be structural change that will benefit the majority of people, that will build hospitals and schools and allow people to, for their freedoms to be respected and for a real respect for the rule of law. With the current regime in Egypt, that's not going to happen. So if Sisi is going to be around for 4 years, the situation will deteriorate and so will violent extremism. Egypt needs a return to democracy.
Mahazam, I want to thank you for joining us from London. Mohamed Kamal in Cairo and Michele Dunne in Washington, D.C. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. We say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
So it's going to be 4 more years after this. It could be more, in fact, because there could be a constitutional change. But anyway, we won't go into that. A lot of skepticism I see online.
Yes, very much so, because to call this a foregone conclusion really is an understatement. And the words I've seen most often in articles from around the world, a sham, farce, even theatrical performance, that this is so fabricated. And we are seeing that kind of thing reflected online, images like this being shared on Twitter, Egypt's 2018 presidential elections, and of course you have Sisi versus Sisi, because there is no real opposition. Any potential opposition was removed via threats and arrests, and what we're left with is an alternative candidate who essentially is backing al-Sisi rather ridiculously, it has to be said. Now, other people are making many of the same jokes, really. Good luck to all Egyptians voting. You have so many choices. Here's a recap, and you've got General Sisi listed many times, and at the bottom there they say 6 prison, 7 death. So it is quite sinister, and people are joking about it, but there is a real tinge of concern about exactly how this will all play out. This Twitter user saying that this is the most shameless presidential election in Egypt Egypt since the last pharaoh in 30 BC. All serious opponents were locked up or exiled, and this one too.
You can't do Egypt without a pharaoh joke, right?
No, indeed. It's obligatory. And this one too saying, I like that the ballot paper has a picture of what happens to the respective candidate if they get the majority of votes, because you've got Al-Sisi there, yes, who is represented by a star, and his opposition, which is an aircraft.
And that's important because in Egypt, 1 out of every 4 citizens can't read and write. So those symbols matter when you're casting a ballot.
Very much so. And of course, the joke here is that if you vote for the other guy, you'll be stuck on a plane and sent out of the country. But yes, it is very important, with 1/4 of all Egyptians not able to read. They have to have that symbol there in order to make it clear for them who they should be voting for if they can't work it out already from the photographs. It's interesting to see, though, that Egypt Independent, which I think is anything but, is claiming that there will be no sanctions against any Egyptians who choose not to vote. There have been a lot of rumours about that. They've spoken to the Parliament Speaker Ali Abdel Al, who denied that the rumours that people would be fined. It isn't stated, however, what happens if they vote for the other guy. Now, as for journalism in general in Egypt, well, certainly there has been quite the crackdown. Belle True, a journalist for The Times, who's been based in Egypt for 7 years.
Had a frequent guest on the show and has worked for us, yeah.
Yes, brilliant reporter, certainly tells it as it is, and clearly that wasn't wanted during this election.
Wasn't wanted during this election. So they need is a high turnout. You talk about the state press there denying that there's been cajoling. Our correspondents say differently, though.
Yes, and there is evidence when you look on social media too. The Voice of America among those saying that really turnout is the only suspense that we can have with regards to this election, because we know what the result is going to be. And what they say is that authorities are hoping for a decent turnout because it does lend legitimacy to Al-Sisi's second term. Others who could, of course, have attracted a sizable protest vote have been pushed out of the way, leaving only really no opposition in reality. The 6th of April movement, which of course was key in the 2011 revolution, they have tweeted their followers to say that they should not vote. Don't vote because of the campaign of repression and arrests of young Egyptians. Of course, talking about the fact there has been this huge crackdown with torture, imprisonment and disappearances even. That cartoon there showing the feet avoiding the ballot box. But there are some people tweeting sort of celebrating the ongoing election, voting and celebrations everywhere, says this woman. This is a gentleman who is apparently painting the Egyptian flag on people's faces to celebrate today's voting. And Egypt Today says that North Sinai has had record high turnout. They've got pictures here of a handful of people turning out to vote. Elsewhere, though, very different takes on this. This political analyst saying dictatorships are often fond of using children for nefarious purposes. These young people really trying to round up the voters. And this one here, these are the actions of normal people going to vote, not people paid for and provided with music to dance to and flags to wave. No, sir, not at all. A very sarcastic take. Unusual and rather strange scenes of celebration there in Egypt.
Yes, I did notice a tinge of irony from Wael. Many thanks for that, Emma James. We'll have more coverage of Egypt coming up in our upcoming editions. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.